Part 3, Swann in Love, Section 8. Other people are, as a rule, so immaterial to us that when we have entrusted to any one of them the power to cause so much suffering or happiness to ourselves, that person seems at once to belong to a different universe, is surrounded with poetry, makes of our lives a vast expanse, quick with sensation, on which that person and ourselves are ever more or less in contact. Swann could not without anxiety ask himself what Odette would mean to him in the years that were to come. Sometimes as he looked up from his victoria on those fine and frosty nights of early spring, and saw the dazzling moonbeams fall between his eyes and the deserted streets, he would think of that other face, gleaming and faintly roseate like the moon's, which had one day risen on the horizon of his mind, and since then had shed upon the world that mysterious light in which he saw it bathed. If he arrived after the hour at which Odette sent her servants to bed, before ringing the bell at the gate of her little garden, he would go round first into the other street, over which, at the ground level, among the windows, all exactly alike, but darkened, of the adjoining houses, shone the solitary lighted window of her room. He would rap upon the pane, and she would hear the signal, and answer, before running to meet him at the gate. He would find, lying open on the piano, some of her favorite music, the Valse des Roses, the Pauvre Fou of Tagliafico, which, according to the instructions embodied in her will, was to be played at her funeral. But he would ask her instead to give him the little phrase from Von Toya's sonata. It was true that Odette played vilely, but often the fairest impression that remains in our minds of a favorite air is one which has arisen out of a jumble of wrong notes struck by unskilful fingers upon a tuneless piano. The little phrase was associated still in Swann's mind with his love for Odette. He felt clearly that this love was something to which there were no corresponding external signs, whose meaning could not be proved by any but himself. He realized, too, that Odette's qualities were not such as to justify his setting so high a value on the hours he spent in her company. And often, when the cold government of reason stood unchallenged, he would readily have ceased to sacrifice so many of his intellectual and social interests to this imaginary pleasure. But the little phrase, as soon as it struck his ear, had the power to liberate in him the room that was needed to contain it. The proportions of Swann's soul were altered. A margin was left for a form of enjoyment which corresponded no more than his love for Odette to any external object, and yet was not, like his enjoyment of that love, purely individual, but assumed for him an objective reality superior to that of other concrete things. This thirst for an untasted charm, the little phrase would stimulate it anew in him, but without bringing him any definite gratification to assuage it, with the result that those parts of Swann's soul in which the little phrase had obliterated all care for material interests, those human considerations which affect all men alike, were left bare by it, blank pages on which he was at liberty to inscribe the name of Odette. Moreover, where Odette's affection might seem ever so little abrupt and disappointing, the little phrase would come to supplement it, to amalgamate with it its own mysterious essence. Watching Swann's face while he listened to the phrase, one would have said that he was inhaling an anesthetic which allowed him to breathe more deeply. And the pleasure which the music gave him, which was shortly to create in him a real longing, was in fact closely akin, at such moments, to the pleasure which he would have derived from experimenting with perfumes, from entering into contract with a world for which we men were not created, which appears to lack form because our eyes cannot perceive it, to lack significance because it escapes our intelligence, to which we may attain by way of one sense only. Deep repose, mysterious refreshment for Swann, for him whose eyes, although delicate interpreters of painting, whose mind, although an acute observer of manners, must bear forever the indelible imprint of the barrenness of his life. To feel himself transformed into a creature foreign to humanity, blinded, deprived of his logical faculty, almost a fantastic unicorn, a chimera-like creature, conscious of the world through his two ears alone. And as, notwithstanding, he sought in the little phrase for a meaning to which his intelligence could not descend, with what a strange frenzy of intoxication must he strip bare his innermost soul of the whole armor of reason, and make it pass unattended through the straining vessel down into the dark filter of sound. He began to reckon up how much that was painful, perhaps even how much secret and unappeased sorrow underlay the sweetness of the phrase. And yet to him it brought no suffering. What matter, though, the phrase repeated that love is frail and fleeting when his love was so strong? He played with the melancholy which the phrase diffused. He felt it stealing over him, but like a caress which only deepened and sweetened his sense of his own happiness. He would make Odette play him the phrase again 10, 20 times on end, insisting that while she played she must never cease to kiss him. Every kiss provokes another. Ah, in those earliest days of love, how naturally the kisses spring into life! How closely in their abundance are they pressed one against another, until lovers would find it as hard to count the kisses exchanged in an hour as to count the flowers in a meadow in May. Then she would pretend to stop, saying, "How do you expect me to play when you keep on holding me? I can't do everything at once. Make up your mind what you want. Am I to play the phrase, or do you want to play with me?" Then he would become annoyed, and she would burst out with a laugh which was transformed as it left her lips and descended upon him in a shower of kisses. Or else she would look at him sulkily, and he would see once again a face worthy to figure in Botticelli's Life of Moses. He would place it there, giving to Odette's neck the necessary inclination. And when he had finished her portrait in distemper, in the 15th century, on the wall of the Sixtine, the idea that she was, none the less, in the room with him still, by the piano, at that very moment, ready to be kissed and won, the idea of her material existence, of her being alive, would sweep over him with so violent an intoxication that, with eyes starting from his head and jaws that parted as though to devour her, he would fling himself upon this Botticelli maiden and kiss and bite her cheeks. And then, as soon as he had left the house, not without returning to kiss her once again, because he had forgotten to take away with him in memory some detail of her fragrance or of her features, while he drove home in his victoria, blessing the name of Odette, who allowed him to pay her these daily visits, which, although they could not, he felt, bring any great happiness to her, still, by keeping him immune from the fever of jealousy, by removing from him every possibility of a fresh outbreak of the heart sickness which had manifested itself in him that evening when he had failed to find her at the Verderons', might help him to arrive without any recurrence of those crises, of which the first had been so distressing that it must also be the last, at the termination of this strange series of hours in his life, hours almost enchanted, in the same manner as these other following hours, in which he drove through a deserted Paris by the light of the moon, noticing as he drove home that the satellite had now changed its position relatively to his own, and was almost touching the horizon. Feeling that his love also was obedient to these immutable laws of nature, he asked himself whether this period upon which he had entered was to last much longer, whether presently his mind's eye would cease to behold that dear countenance, save as occupying a distant and diminished position, and on the verge of ceasing to shed on him the radiance of its charm. For Swann was finding in things once more, since he had fallen in love, the charm that he had found when, in his adolescence, he had fancied himself an artist, with this difference, that what charm lay in them now was conferred by Odette alone. He could feel reawakening in himself the inspirations of his boyhood, which had been dissipated among the frivolities of his later life. But they all bore now the reflection, the stamp of a particular being, and during the long hours which he now found a subtle pleasure in spending at home, alone with his convalescent spirit, he became gradually himself again, but himself in thraldom to another. He went to her only in the evenings, and knew nothing of how she spent her time during the day, any more than he knew of her past, so little, indeed, that he had not even the tiny, initial clue, which, by allowing us to imagine what we do not know, stimulates a desire for knowledge. And so he never asked himself what she might be doing, or what her life had been. Only he smiled sometimes at the thought of how, some years earlier, when he still did not know her, some one had spoken to him of a woman who, if he remembered rightly, must certainly have been Odette. As of a tart, a kept woman, one of those women to whom he still attributed, having lived but little in their company, the entire set of characteristics, fundamentally perverse, with which they had been for many years endowed by the imagination of certain novelists. He would say to himself that one has, as often as not, only to take the exact counterpart of the reputation created by the world in order to judge a person fairly, when with such a character he contrasted that of Odette, so good, so simple, so enthusiastic in the pursuit of ideals, so nearly incapable of not telling the truth, that, when he had once begged her, so that they might dine together alone, to write to Madame Verdurin, saying that she was unwell, the next day he had seen her face to face with Madame Verdurin, who asked whether she had recovered, blushing, stammering, and in spite of herself, revealing in every feature how painful, what a torture it was to her to act a lie. And while in her answer she multiplied the fictitious details of an imaginary illness, seeming to ask pardon by her suppliant look and her stricken accents for the obvious falsehood of her words. On certain days, however, though these came seldom, she would call upon him in the afternoon, to interrupt his musings or the essay on Vermeer to which he had latterly returned. His servants would come in to say that Madame de Crécy was in the small drawing room. He would go in search of her, and when he opened the door on Odette's blushing countenance, as soon as she caught sight of Swann, would appear, changing the curve of her lips, the look in her eyes, the molding of her cheeks, an all-absorbing smile. Once he was left alone, he would see again that smile, and her smile of the day before, another with which she had greeted him some time else, the smile which had been her answer, in the carriage that night, when he had asked her whether she objected to his rearranging her catelias. And the life of Odette at all other times, since he knew nothing of it, appeared to him upon a neutral and colorless background, like those sheets of sketches by Watteau upon which one sees, here and there, in every corner and in all directions, traced in three colors upon the buff paper, innumerable smiles. But once in a while, illuminating a chink of that existence which Swann still saw as a complete blank, even if his mind assured him that it was not so, because he was unable to imagine anything that might occupy it, some friend who knew them both, and suspecting that they were in love, had not dared to tell him anything about her that was of the least importance, would describe Odette's figure as he had seen her that very morning, going on foot up the Rue Abatucci, in a cape trimmed with skunks, wearing a Rembrandt hat and a bunch of violets in her bosom. This simple outline reduced Swann to utter confusion, by enabling him suddenly to perceive that Odette had an existence which was not wholly subordinated to his own. He burned to know whom she had been seeking to fascinate by this costume in which he had never seen her. He registered a vow to insist upon her telling him where she had been going at that intercepted moment, as though in all the colorless life, a life almost non-existent since she was then invisible to him, of his mistress, there had been but a single incident apart from all those smiles directed towards himself, namely, her walking abroad beneath a Rembrandt hat with a bunch of violets in her bosom. Except when he asked her for Von Toya's little phrase, instead of the Valse de Roses, Swann made no effort to induce her to play the things that he himself preferred, nor, in literature any more than in music, to correct the manifold errors of her taste. He fully realized that she was not intelligent. When she said how much she would like him to tell her about the great poets, she had imagined that she would suddenly get to know whole pages of romantic and heroic verse, in the style of the Vicomte de Borelli, only even more moving. As for Vermeer of Delft, she asked whether he had been made to suffer by a woman, if it was a woman that had inspired him, and once Swann had told her that no one knew, she had lost all interest in that painter. She would often say, "I'm sure, poetry, well, of course, there'd be nothing like it if it was all true, if the poets really believed the things they said. But as often as not you'll find there's no one so mean and calculating as those fellows. I know something about poetry. I had a friend once who was in love with a poet of sorts. In his verses he never spoke of anything but love and heaven and the stars. Oh, she was properly taken in. He had more than 300,000 francs out of her before he'd finished." If then Swann tried to show her in what artistic beauty consisted, how one ought to appreciate poetry or painting, After a minute or two she would cease to listen, saying, "Yes, I never thought it would be like that." And he felt that her disappointment was so great that he preferred to lie to her, assuring her that what he had said was nothing, that he had only touched the surface, that he had not time to go into it all properly, that there was more in it than that. Then she would interrupt with a brisk, "More in it? What? Do tell me." But he did not tell her, for he realized how petty it would appear to her, and how different from what she had expected, less sensational and less touching. He was afraid, too, lest, disillusioned in the matter of art, she might at the same time be disillusioned in the greater matter of love, with the result that she found Swann inferior intellectually to what she had supposed. "You're always so reserved, I can't make you out." She marveled increasingly at his indifference to money, at his courtesy to every one alike, at the delicacy of his mind. And indeed it happens often enough to a greater man than Swann ever was, to a scientist or artist, than when he is not wholly misunderstood by the people among whom he lives, that the feeling in them which proves that they have been convinced of the superiority of his intellect is created not by any admiration for his ideas, for those are entirely beyond them, but by their respect for what they term his good qualities. There was also the respect with which Odette was inspired by the thought of Swann's social position, although she had no desire that he should attempt to secure invitations for herself. Perhaps she felt that such attempts would be bound to fail; perhaps, indeed, she feared lest merely by speaking of her to his friends he should provoke disclosures of an unwelcome kind. The fact remains that she had consistently held him to his promise never to mention her name. Her reason for not wishing to go into society was, she had told him, a quarrel which she had had long ago with another girl, who had avenged herself by saying nasty things about her. "But," Swann objected, "surely people don't all know your friend." "Yes, don't you see? It's like a spot of oil. People are so horrid." Swann was unable, frankly, to appreciate this point. On the other hand, he knew that such generalizations as "people are so horrid," and "a word of scandal spreads like a spot of oil," were generally accepted as true. There must therefore be cases to which they were literally applicable. Could Odette's case be one of these? He teased himself with the question, though not for long, for he too was subject to that mental oppression which had so weighed upon his father whenever he was faced by a difficult problem. In any event, that world of society which concealed such terrors for Odette inspired her probably with no very great longing to enter it, since it was too far removed from the world which she already knew for her to be able to form any clear conception of it. At the same time, while in certain respects she had retained a genuine simplicity, she had, for instance, kept up a friendship with a little dressmaker, now retired from business, up whose steep and dark and fetid staircase she clambered almost every day. She still thirsted to be in the fashion, though her idea of it was not altogether that held by fashionable people. For the latter, fashion is a thing that emanates from a comparatively small number of leaders, who project it to a considerable distance, with more or less strength, according as one is nearer to or farther from their intimate center, over the widening circle of their friends and the friends of their friends, whose names form a sort of tabulated index. People in society know this index by heart. They are gifted in such matters with an erudition from which they have extracted a sort of taste, of tact, so automatic in its operation that Swann, for example, without needing to draw upon his knowledge of the world, if he read in a newspaper the names of the people who had been guests at a dinner, could tell at once how fashionable the dinner had been, just as a man of letters, merely by reading a phrase, can estimate exactly the literary merit of its author. But Odette was one of those persons, an extremely numerous class, whatever the fashionable world may think, and to be found in every section of society, who do not share this knowledge, but imagine fashion to be something of quite another kind, which assumes different aspects according to the circle to which they themselves belong, but has the special characteristic, common alike to the fashion of which Odette used to dream, and to that before which Madame Cotard bowed, of being directly accessible to all. The other kind, the fashion of fashionable people, is, it must be admitted, accessible also, but there are inevitable delays. Odette would say of some one, "He never goes to any place that isn't really smart." And if Swann were to ask her what she meant by that, she would answer, with a touch of contempt, "Smart places? Why, good heavens, just fancy, at your age, having to be told what the smart places are in Paris. What do you expect me to say? Well, on Sunday mornings there's the Avenue de l'Impératrice, and round the lake at 5 o'clock, and on Thursdays the Eden Theatre, and the Hippodrome on Fridays. Then there are the balls. What balls? Why, silly, the balls people give in Paris, the smart ones, I mean. Wait now, Herbinger, you know who I mean, the fellow who's in one of the jobbers' offices. Yes, of course, you must know him. He's one of the best known men in Paris. That great big fair-haired boy who wears such swagger clothes. He always has a flower in his buttonhole and a light-colored overcoat with a fold down the back. He goes about with that old image, takes her to all the first nights. Very well. He gave a ball the other night, and all the smart people in Paris were there. I should have loved to go. But you had to show your invitation at the door, and I couldn't get one anywhere. After all, I'm just as glad now that I didn't go. I should have been killed in the crush and seen nothing. Still, just to be able to say one had been to Herbinger's ball. You know how vain I am. However, you may be quite certain that half the people who tell you they were there are telling stories. But I am surprised that you weren't there, a regular tip-topper like you." Swann made no attempt, however, to modify this conception of fashion. Feeling that his own came no nearer to the truth, was just as fatuous, devoid of all importance, he saw no advantage to be gained by imparting it to his mistress, with the result that, after a few months, she ceased to take any interest in the people to whose houses he went, except when they were the means of his obtaining tickets for the paddock at race meetings or first nights at the theatre. She hoped that he would continue to cultivate such profitable acquaintances, but she had come to regard them as less smart since the day when she had passed the Marquise de Villeparisis in the street, wearing a black serge dress and a bonnet with strings. "But she looks like a pew opener, like an old charwoman, darling. That a marquise? Goodness knows I'm not a marquise, but you'd have to pay me a lot of money before you'd get me to go about Paris rigged out like that." End of part 3, section 8.